Computer Programming for Kids, Step 22, Examining the Code with Annotations. In the last step, we showed all the code as it appears in Visual Studio, as well as the text version of it, making it easy for you to print out or copy and paste. In this step, we will show the code as it actually runs when we use the app in the expected way. By the expected way, I mean when a user selects a file from the combo box and continues selecting answers from the radio buttons and clicking the next button until the user has answered all of the questions. When that is the case, the expected thing is done, the code is called in this order. And then in the newsletter, you'll see the list of the calls to the code. At that point, as the user continues going through the questions, the code beneath the comment that says user selects one of the radio buttons above repeats until the end of the questions is reached. Don't feel bad if it sometimes seems like you're doing something like this with your code. And then in the newsletter, you would see an image of a Rube Goldberg invention. What seems complicated or convoluted or even downright Rube Goldberg-esque at first will eventually become much clearer to you as you learn to think in C#. Even if at times you feel like you are overwhelmed and swamped and even shipwrecked and being attacked by ravenous bears, like these cats, and it shows a painting of exactly that happening, never fear. Stick with it, keep at it, and eventually it will be relatively smooth sailing for you, like it is for these frolicking denizens of the deep blue sea. And it shows a picture of 3 dolphins, a photograph of 3 dolphins surfing the waves. Can't you just tell by the look on their flippers that those dolphins are having the time of their lives? When the last question is reached, load next batch sets freeze answer to true, and that should be the end of the first CSV file. Now we will show the code again, but this time with annotations, briefly explaining what is happening. The parts of the code that actually run, in other words, what is between the curly braces, not the names of the methods, variable and constant declarations and curly braces and such, are bolded. Code which may or may not run, depending on circumstances, is both bolded and italicized. Then it shows the form 1 load event method so that the text property of the question label and the percent label can be restored to their original state. That state, the text value, is stored in variables for later use when the user loads a new CSV file. And then it shows the next event handler method, which is a drop-down event for the combo box, the code for that. The first line above checks to see if the combo box has already been populated with values. If it has been, there are 1 or more entries in it. It stops there by calling return. The rest of the code after that first line is italicized because it only runs if there were no entries in the combo box. So it only runs the first time the combo box is dropped down. Actually, the line of code in the for each block between the matched curly braces could be double italicized, if such were possible, because it will only run if there was at least 1 CSV file found in the folder it's searching, which we assume would be the case. The get file names method above is called from the previous event handler, the drop-down event of the combo box. It gets all files with the extension CSV and populates them into the string array named underscore file names, which is then passed back to the calling method. So, in effect, the drop-down event handler is saying, hey, get file names method, give me all the CSV files, without even saying please, you may have noticed. Some methods can be kind of bossy and demanding that way. The getFileNames method then dutifully fetches the files. Fetch is not just for dogs anymore. It's a common programming word synonymous with get, and passes them back to the drop-down event handler. So the string array file names in the drop-down event handler is assigned the string array underscore file names passed back from the getFileNames method. Thus, underscore file names in getFileNames is a temporary stand-in for file names in the drop-down event handler, you might say. Since they are the same data type, a string array, one can be assigned to the other. Note: now is as good a time as any to explain the second part of a method, signature. The signature is the part at the top. In the case of get file names, it is private, string array, or string left bracket, right bracket, get file names, and then in parentheses, string path to search. The first part, private, we talked a little bit about in an earlier step. When private, the method can only be seen by other code in the same file. It's a little more complicated than that at times, but for now, think of it that way. The second part, which comes before the actual name of the method, is the return type of the method. It is often void, which means nothing is returned. The method does some work but returns nothing to the caller. If there is something besides void there, though, callers of the method are expecting to receive that data type returned to them. That's why the final line of code, return _ file names, in the get file names method is the appropriate thing to do. It is passing back the expected string array to the caller. Then it shows another bit of code. The combo box's selected index changed event handler. And there's quite a bit of code here. The code above, which is the event handler for the combo box, when an item is selected, is admittedly rather long and complex. In a nutshell, what it's doing is responding to the user selecting a file from the list in the combo box. We've talked about this code in an earlier step, but we'll briefly say a couple of things about it here also. Note, remember that only the steppable code is bolded, the lines that the debugger will actually take you to when you step through the code line by line. It steps over, ignores in a sense, the names of the methods, the variable and constant declarations, the curly braces, etc. And the code that is both bolded and italicized may or may not run, depending on the current state of things. In fact, almost all of the code is subject to not running should an exception occur, but in general, what you see bolded will run, and what you see both bolded and italicized might run, depending on circumstances. Note that when a file is selected from the list a second and third, etc. time, the first else block makes use of those two string values that were saved at the beginning when the app started up in the form load event. In either case, the first time a file is selected from the combo box or a subsequent time, all the lines from the selected file are read into a string array. Instances of the multiple choice class are then populated with the values from the line. One line's comma-separated values to each class instance. At the end of each loop, the instance is added to MCC list, the collection or list object of multiple choice classes. After all that populating is done, the end of the file has been reached and all the class instances have been populated and been added to the list. The load next batch method is called. And it shows that method, which is fairly long. The load next batch method has been discussed before too. Basically, what's happening is just as its name indicates. It adds a new question and the appropriate label, and a new set of candidate answers for that question in the radio buttons. Before that, it disables the next button and sets all of the radio buttons to being unselected. It also conditionally updates the progress bar's value. Perhaps the most interesting part is the assignment to the freeze answer Boolean variable, which indicates whether or not this is the final question. A little more on that. Recall that multiple choice class index is the integer variable used to access which multiple choice class instance to access in MCC list, the collection of those classes. So say there are 10 questions. Since the first class is accessed when multiple choice class index is 0, remember, computers view the first item as item 0, not item 1. When the last class instance is about to be accessed, the value of multiple choice class index is 9, since 9 will access the 10th class instance. So this code, where multiple choice class instance plus index plus 1 equals number of questions is assigned to the freeze answer Boolean variable, will in that case set the freeze answer bool variable to true as 9 plus 1 equals 10, and that is the value that the int variable number of questions is assigned when there are 10 questions. So if the following code is about to access the last class instance, freeze answer being true, in effect tells everybody that wants to know, any code that accesses it, be careful, this is the last question. And then the update question number label method is shown. We've already discussed the update question number label method too. It advises the user how many questions there are and which question he is currently on. Question 7 of 10 or question 42 of 99 or whatever. Then it shows the checked changed event handler of radio button 1. This code runs when a radio button is clicked. Recall that all 3 of the radio buttons share this same event handler, even though it is named radio button 1. So if the value of the freeze answer bool variable is true, indicating that this is the last question, some information on the screen is updated and the next button is disabled, assuming one of the radio buttons has been selected. Then it shows the update percentage correct method. Called by the radio button's check changed event handler just discussed, update percentage correct does exactly what its name indicates. Just how it does this, though, is interesting. First, it determines whether the answer selected by the user is the correct one by calling the answer is correct method. Note, when a method has a name that can be answered yes or no, or how the heck should I know, it probably returns a bool value. Then answer is correct computes the answer is correct int variable and assigns it to the appropriate label. The mechanism behind this has already been discussed too, though. Update percentage correct also updates the progress bar while it's added. This is independent of whether the question was answered correctly or not. It advances the progress bar value to indicate how many of the questions have been answered, not caring itself how many correct answers there have been. And then it shows the answer is correct code, that method. To determine whether the user selected the right answer, the answer is correct method first stores the correct answer by reading the correct answer value from the current multiple choice class instance. Then it compares that to the radio buttons. When it finds the one selected, or checked, it assigns its value to the answer selected, int variable. Then either true or false is returned to the caller in the last line by comparing the correct answer with the selected answer. If they match, true is returned. Otherwise, of course, false is returned. Note, we could have used code like answer selected equals candidate answer 1, but in this instance, no pun intended, it seemed easier just to use the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Besides, we would have had to make those constants, candidate answer 1, etc., global in order to do that. Not a big deal, but perhaps enough to leave well enough alone in this case. And then it shows finally the click event handler for button 1 or the next button, btn next. When the next button is clicked, it increments the question's answer int variable unless it is the last one. Then it calls the code to update the percentage label visited earlier. Then, if we have reached the end of the file, it returns without populating a new set of question and candidate answers. Otherwise, it does do that by calling load next batch. Finally, we cannot forget this important piece of code from the multiple choice class.cs code file, and then it shows the code for that class. The multiple choice class object being defined here is the pattern or recipe for the multiple choice class cookies or instances that we use to store the questions and candidate answers and correct answer value. All members of the class are given default values: an empty string, no text for the string members, and a 0 for the int member. Note, a saying which applies to life in general also applies to programming, as illustrated by assigning nothing values to these members by default. The saying is, nothing is often the best thing to do, and usually the best thing to say. You cause these members to say nothing until they have something valid to say by assigning them these default nothing values. In the next step, join me as we enter the deep dark jungle on a bug squashing mission, debugging our slightly faulty code by stepping through it line by line. Be sure to bring your coding machete with you. Until then,